Hello and welcome to Men's Mental Health. Today we're going to be talking about the feminist approach to men's mental health, such as it is. We're joined by Tom Golden and Paul Elam. Tom is a red pill therapist that believes strongly that men are good. You can find him at menaregood.com, Men Are Good on Patreon and YouTube, and at trgolden on Twitter. Paul is the founder of A Voice for Men and An Ear for Men, and you can find him at An Ear for Men on YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter. Finally, on point is Tanis, the Prim Reaper, currently taking a master's in counseling. So, our panelists, do you guys have any initial words about the subject?
No words needed.
My therapist said it wasn't my fault.
Okay, so do you want to start with the first comment that was originally placed on Prim Reaper's channel? But we're going to cover it here.
Yes, I've actually done a couple of videos about this topic, and somebody posted a comment, Phoenix Shaman 3 months ago, hating men, especially straight white men, is not only acceptable in academia and many aspects of life, but also in the mental health fields where men go to get help when they are at their weakest, only to be crushed by the feminists who have infested the places where they are going for help. I speak from experience. Fun fact, I have bipolar, GAD, ADD, and PTSD, the last being from the abuse I suffered from my mother, sister, and for the most part, women, as well as those in the mental health field who tortured me in psych wards. I am supposed to be on meds for these issues. Supposed. I am no longer on meds because the LPN who works at my now ex-psychiatrist's office decided that it wasn't her job to fill out the prior authorizations, tier exemptions, or appeals for my meds. She also fabricated things on my medical reports, including past diagnoses that no longer applied, and my smoking, drinking, and behavioral patterns. The doctor she worked for either didn't condemn what she did or actively condoned her behavior. I'm just lucky that I'm doing better without meds than I was with them. I also had problems with two of the same company's psychotherapists as I was trying to get away from my then current one, who wasn't a feminist, just believed all the same things as the feminists and acted only a little bit better. The female feminist psychotherapist I was interviewing with set me up with an appointment with a non-feminist psychotherapist who behaved exactly like and believed the same things as feminists, only didn't apply the label to himself, subversive little Marxist that he was, and both of them abused or gaslit me either directly or by proxy. Also, that female feminist psychotherapist, I told her she may not be as bad as the feminists I had met, but that I didn't have the emotional capital to invest in her. And you know what she did when I was extremely polite and gracious? She proved me right. This is why I really appreciate people like you. You are working to undo the damage feminists have done to the mental health systems, or so it appears from what you say and do. I tend to think that the PRC and Japan's mental health systems are better than the West's, for a non-existent system is much better than one that actively harms those it is supposed to help. Sorry for the wall, and I have many, many more stories like those if you'd like to hear them, and if they could help you with the mission of true equality.
Yeah. This is a very big subject.
I hear so many stories like this all the time from people.
Yeah, for every one story, for example, on Twitter, the young man, I believe it was a young man who informed me that Calm, the campaign against living miserably, did help him, yet has a feminist framework. Although, interestingly enough, he did insist on saying that men were to blame for not or being too proud to go to therapy. So he did evince some of the, shall we call it, brainwashing or influence of that feminist framework on his thinking, but he did say that it did help him. Then again, there's all of these letters, like almost an endless stream of letters of people who are men who were not helped by this system. So what do you guys have to say, Tom and Paul?
Go ahead, Paul. Oh, she knew your name better than mine, man. First, by all means.
Yeah, I see this all the time. Probably not quite as bad as the person writing in, but it's not uncommon for me to see people who've been to therapists who are just hateful towards men. I could tell you some stories that would just light you up about what I see with other therapists ignoring the emotional pain of men. It's mind blowing when you think about it. It's like we're supposed to be there to help, and they only help certain people. It's just it's nutty. It's absolutely nutty, and it's based, of course, on lies. The whole feminist theory stuff is just based on lies that men are the oppressors and men are the root of all problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so their well-being depends upon holding that idea in mind. And if you hold that idea in mind, of course you're going to treat men like shit. So, it's kind of expected in some ways, but it's just so mind-blowing that they get away with it.
Yeah. I guess I'd add to that it was my experiences in the mental health field that led me to be an anti-feminist and an MRA.
Yes.
That is precisely what did it. I had woken up to the issues by reading Myth of Male Power when it came out in its first edition. But it was reading that got me to thinking about male clients and about our general treatment based on sex in that area of mental health, which was chemical dependency treatment. And I noticed that one of the first things right away was that we assessed every female we admitted to the program for whether or not that she had been a victim of domestic violence. And we pretty much assessed every male for whether or not they'd been a perpetrator. But we never asked men, if they had been the victims of violence in the home, and we never asked women how much violence they were committing in the home. Now, if it came out that they were harming a child and we found out about it, we did get access to the information that way. But most of it was hidden by the entire family when the mother was violent. But to make a long story short, when I started talking about that with my peers and started questioning my clients, and all of a sudden, wow, all these guys were telling me the things that had happened to them in the home. And when I questioned the staff, the people that I worked with, including the psychiatrists and psychologists that worked there and my peer counselors and our administrators, the reaction was hostility. They wanted me to quit talking about this. So it wasn't even just indifference.
Right.
It was an outright hostility to the idea that of men in vulnerable positions.
Yes.
And this was before there was a well-founded feminist control of mental health profession. I think a lot of this was just natural social gynocentrism speaking, but then the feminist edge that was brought into that just made it that much more vicious.
Yes. Oh gosh, I'm so glad that.
Let's discover the source of the echo. I think it's Tom.
I would doubt it. I got headphones on.
Okay, Prim, is it you?
I had my mic turned off that entire.
Okay, all right. Well,
all right. That only leaves one culprit, unless it's Mike.
The echo's gone away. Someone's crashing glasses in the background, but the echo's gone away.
I was just saying, I'm so glad that you said that, because a lot of why I got into this is because of what I've read in my psychology classes. And oh my goodness, you say that it was just starting to get into the field back when you were starting out. It has really infested the field now in my classes. It's just astounding. We have a real treat for later on in the show. Oh my goodness.
Speaking of later on in the show, why don't we move to the next email, not a comment. This was an email that was received at the Honey Badger Radio Badger Rights account. So go ahead, Prim.
Okay. First, thank you for fighting the good fight. Second, Allison's passion when talking about the mental health issues allows me to feel safe enough to vent a bit more outside my circle and self. To Allison and Karen, the rage professionals, I love listening to the rage and the rants. Thank you for voicing some things that I would want to say myself. Third, specifically for Tom, the counselor, I wonder how you're able to practice with the SJW environment. I'm currently studying, and I remember my multiculturalism class and microaggressions. I'm left wondering, what haven't I done wrong?
Well, I can comment a little bit about that being Tom, and that is that my first 15 years in the field was done in a place that specialized in death and dying and grieving. And so I was completely immune from the feminist stuff because they didn't go there. You know, they were in the counseling centers, but really not in the death and dying areas. So I was immune until I started doing workshops on about how men are different in the way they process emotions. Once I did that, then I started getting, you know, the 3 to 5% of the feminists who would come to these workshops just completely insane about how I was saying that men needed special care. You know, it was like they blew their minds, and it kind of blew my mind that people were so upset about it. So I got introduced to things, and since then I'm in private practice, so I don't have to deal with any SJWs. You know, so that's how I stay away from it.
Tips for later.
Paul, did you have something to add to that?
No, I just probably echo the same sentiments. I do all my work independently. I wouldn't work on staff in a mainstream facility these days if my life depended on it.
And it might.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to add something to what was said there. Recently, we spoke about, me and Prim, and I believe on the previous mental health episode, that we spoke about how feminist therapy outright says, actually, you know what? I mentioned this on a video that I did a few weeks ago on Robert Webb's How Not to Be a Boy, which is very aptly named. And what was interesting about that was that the feminists outright say, at least in what Prim has presented to me, that the intent of feminist therapy is to use the client, the patient, as a conduit for ideology. And when I read a few of Prim's tidbits, and I'm astounded by what I'm reading, and I'm not surprised about what Tom said about how men, they were offended at the idea that men needed special care in the ways that they grieve, or special recognition about how they processed emotions. Right. Because when I'm reading these tidbits, I can see something that they would never acknowledge. And that thing is that women, and the way women experience emotions, and the way women are patients, in other words, the way women receive mental health care when they have mental health issues, is considered to be the ideal standard. And men are held up to that standard. And if they don't conform to that standard, they're considered to be defective. And Correct. That they need to change to conform to the therapy that is supposed to be about helping them with their needs. Yes. And it's just the combination of the idea that the patient exists to perpetuate feminist ideology, and that men, that you don't actually create a therapeutic modality for the patient, but the patient exists for that modality. That is like out of an 18th century insane asylum. That isn't modern medicine.
I don't think they would have gone that far in the 18th century. I really don't. And your point is well taken, because first of all, when you think about it, what the F is up with the idea of ideologically based therapy to begin with? Feminist therapy is like Republican therapy or capitalist therapy. It totally defies every principle of psychotherapy you ever used to be taught in school.
It's
you
awful.
Can't have feminist therapy. What you have is pathogenic therapists, people who take their own issues and their own ideology and act them out. And sure enough, feminism was a good fit with that, with the Duluth model, with patriarchy theory. The theory was that all violence in the home, which of course is only committed by men, is an extension of patriarchy. It's an extension of man's dominance into the home. And that is the model for approaching it, which is why they're so desperate to suppress evidence that shows female perpetrators, because that blows patriarchy theory out of the water. But that is, in fact, exactly what happened. And I think it's also interesting to note, and I'd be interested to see if Tom agrees, before there was a really huge influence of feminists in the mental health community, there was still pressure on men to process emotions, to deal with grief, to meet treatment objectives in the feminine mold. There was a lot of pressure that existed before feminists entered the picture.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. Yeah, men have always been thought to be healthy if they can act more like women. I mean, as crazy as that is, that's the reality of the situation. Of course, gynocentrism is what's pushing this, and it's the framework that holds people in place. And it's the framework that also allows feminism to get away with the bullshit that it gets away with.
It was always, I guess, a myth in my mind that as far as men were concerned in the mental health field, that they somehow benefited from emulating the emotional catharsis of women by talking about problems, articulating feelings, and getting a sense of healing out of that. And that's still, I think, healthy and appropriate for a lot of men who that works for.
Yes.
I mean, you do have to treat people like individuals, but by and large, that isn't how men heal. It isn't how they go through much of anything. And so I think, if anything, maybe radical feminism did us a favor by creating enough thought about what was going on in the mental health itself by MRAs and to men's advocates, that we actually came up with an understanding of what has been wrong there all along. What feminism did was intensify the problems 100-fold.
Yes, and give us a sense of what they thought it was, which was so wrong that we had to come up with something that we thought it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just, to be honest, I don't, like, when I'm reading these feminist tidbits from this feminist epistemology or whatever the heck it is, they don't seem to recognize that women are seen as the reactors, the people whose emotional landscape is the platonic ideal of emotional reaction to things. Even if you allow for men to be considered to be the ideal of how we act, women are seen as the ideal of how we react. And you can see that simply in any video, any movie. When something happens, when an event happens, and the movie producer wants to show how the audience should react to it, well, who do they show? Who do they immediately? What gender do they immediately find a member of and show? It's a woman.
Sure.
And that is and in these feminist tidbits, they don't even see the fact that that is seen. The ideal reacting human is a female. Even if the ideal acting human is male, the ideal reacting human is female.
Unless the action's to jump on a grenade.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of a sudden, we're going to get real equality around here when the grenade gets dropped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the reaction is to scream in terror at the bodies that have just been exploded and go, "Oh, why me?"
Well, then that gives them a chance to focus on the woman grieving after the guy's blown all over the place.
Well, that's what Hillary Clinton says is the real victim of war, right?
Yeah.
Shall we go into the feminist into the funhouse?
Yes. Oh my goodness. So I'm glad that you mentioned that ideology doesn't belong in psychology, because I completely agree. And when I was reading my textbooks for my counseling theories class, I was struck because most of the theories in that textbook, every chapter had a new theory talking about it, and most of them were all talking about how best to help the client, the individual, sort through what their issues were. But the feminist chapter was very different, and I've actually pulled a few choice sections from one of these chapters. Good. And so basically I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from them, and then we can kind of just talk about them together. So this first part: Feminist counseling grew from these consciousness-raising groups, which played important roles in educating, radicalizing, and mobilizing women in the early 1970s. These groups were instrumental in helping women gain personal insight, but they were not as effective in producing political change. Thus, they became a chief mechanism for effecting personal change and support for their members, but left a void where broader change at a societal level was needed. As the therapeutic value of consciousness-raising groups became evident and the need for more structured groups grew, the 1970s marked the beginning of feminist counseling as a recognized approach to psychotherapy. Feminist counseling evolved, however, without being founded by a specific person, theoretical position, or set of techniques. This early phase of feminist counseling was predicated on the assumptions that women had shared experiences of oppression and victimization, and that only a proactive approach could be effective. Early feminist counselors helped name other issues facing women and worked to adapt traditional therapies to meet the needs of women.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
You know, we really should be getting paid for this. That was painful.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. But that's what's happening. That's the idea.
And it's, I mean, basically what that was is that they rationalized an echo chamber as an emergent form of psychotherapy. They said it became recognized. Well, who recognized it? There was other so-called feminist therapists. All they did was populate the mental health professional with enough professions with enough ideologues, and then act like they were one of the founding fathers of psychology. I'm sorry, but they got a long way to go to catch Adler or any of them.
They're young.
I personally loved how they assume that all women have a shared experience of oppression. Like,
And
who made you the leader of all women?
That's the essence of it. The first thing that women need to understand is to agree with their ideology before you can even do any therapy. I mean, that's what I think someone was talking about before, was the connection of ideology with the therapy. And there it is. You have to convince women that they're oppressed. And of course, this includes showing that men are assholes.
Wow, too bad there isn't like the feminist diabetes treatment, you know. Agree with our therapy before you get your shots of insulin.
That's it.
Oh, feminist cardiac surgery. Agree with our therapy or our ideology before you get your coronary bypass.
Yeah.
High glucose is a social construct.
Well,
okay. Shall we go a little bit further? I actually am. The thing is that what feminist therapy or what feminist theory says to men and women, how have they managed to create something that is I won't say equally toxic, but it manages to be toxic to both, and then nobody ever questions it.
I don't know. I've tried to question it a little bit, but still, most of the class is singing its praises.
First acknowledge your complete inability to have any control over any aspect of your life, and let's proceed with your mental health therapy.
Oh, literally. In fact, that's in fact what the next section says.
Oh, okay, I said that with all sarcasm and found Poe's law.
Seriously, these are direct quotes from this book.
Yeah, and what's sad about all that is it's missing the real meat of what happens as people enter the mental health professions. And the experience you get, I'll never forget my very first counseling job. My supervisor told me the first day, said, you know, if you work really hard in 3 years, you will probably understand the difference between your issues and your client's issues. And there was really a great deal of wisdom.
Yes.
In that a lot of the foundation of providing good mental health support to anybody is the practitioner has to get their own stuff out of the way. And what you're hearing in those excerpts that were read from this feminist literature is that we are going to make our stuff the way. That's what they're actually saying. rather than learning how to get their personal and political out of the way of their jobs. Correct. And so what you were reading from there is a textbook description of pathology on part of practitioners.
Absolutely.
Yep, I agree.
But this next section says, feminist theory progressed through 3 distinct phases: radical, liberal, and moderate.
Wrong. Sorry, I had to say it.
That's okay. Early feminist theory called for a radical form of counseling and psychotherapy, using techniques that were designed to help women see that a patriarchal society was at the center of many of their problems, and that change would be virtually impossible until they were empowered to feel equal and act with equal voice.
Oh, please stop for a second.
Okay.
How did nobody stop this? Okay, I'm not going to swear. How? I can't even believe how this wasn't stopped on the principle of, at least, you know what, I'm gonna say something that may be totally verboten, but why wasn't this at least stopped on the principle of gynocentrism? Because this is
well, because the first rule of gynocentrism is that you don't talk about gynocentrism.
Right.
But this itself, this feminist theory itself, is essentially, listen to what it's saying. They're saying that they're essentially taking women and saying that there's no way for you to ever resolve your problems.
Right. It's a religion.
They're using them, and they're making they're actually, they're essentially, let me use an analogy that may make this a little bit more clear. I'll go back to that insulin analogy. They're basically keeping some woman's insulin in a freaking cabinet, locked up, with a feminist key, and saying, well, you have to do what we say and believe as we say and fight the fight that we think you should fight before you get control of your life back, which you never will, because this fight will never end. This is even on even looking at it through a gynocentric lens. This is exploitation of female clients. I don't know what the word is. Patients.
Allison, this is liberation.
Yeah. I can give you an even more concrete example of exactly what you're talking about, Allison. We went from what happens in chemical dependency treatment is very simple. The idea is to get the client to look very honestly at their own behavior, their own actions, what they're doing with their lives, to take responsibility for it, and to try to move on and piece things together. But that responsibility, the accountability, is critical to what we do to try to help people with addictions. When feminists came in and started taking over everything in mental health, one of the things that changed about treatment is that the focus of the nature of the problem. When we were bringing female clients in there and feminist therapists were getting a hold of them, the message was, well, you got a problem with alcohol, right? But your real problem is men. Let's look at the relationship you're in now. And then you would see those relationships start to deteriorate. Now, admittedly, relationships that are going on around alcohol and drug abuse aren't that stable to begin with. But the focus for those clients was put on men and on their oppression and how their abuse had been always happening in their lives, not getting them to focus on the fact that most of them were, in fact, abusers in one way or another, that they were chemically dependent, and that if they didn't get a good look in the mirror at their own mistakes and their own poor judgment, they weren't going to make it very far. And that's what I saw, was women coming in, and they didn't get pissed off at their relationship with alcohol or drugs. They got pissed off at men, which added a whole new set of problems to their lives, which I think, if you add divorce 2 weeks out of a treatment center, I think your chance of relapse are pretty good.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, well, I don't want to focus too much on that. I just find it astounding that even on a principle of, do no harm to women, feminism fails, like the F triple minus. Anyway, Prim, go ahead.
Okay, I'm actually gonna skip the next section and save it for a little bit ahead, just because of something else that got brought up. But I want to remind you that this is in an actual textbook. Many early practitioners of feminist counseling promoted the goal of androgyny, integration of both traditional masculine and feminine characteristics, as an ideal of mental health. Androgyny research and behavioral skills training became the standard for feminist counseling. Feminist counselors were encouraged to choose from all traditional intervention methods that did not support gender-biased outcomes.
What the? Okay, but did not support gender-biased outcomes. So how do you blame men and absolve women of all responsibility if you have a gender bias or a non-gender biased outcome or treatment?
You just don't talk about that part.
It's so confusing, isn't it?
No, it seems to be everything that feminism needs to be for it to perpetuate itself.
Well, because this model, in one way or another, makes the work done about the life and experiences of the practitioner. Doesn't have anything to do with the clients. This whole mess is about tailoring their professional lives to one expression or another of their own issues. And that's the only thing going on here. So there's not going to be any consistency. There's not going to be any sense made about it. You're going to read one place where, talk about oppression, and in other places where it seems to give the exact opposite message. It'll never make any sense, because the whole point is that this is about them.
Yes, and the them is a religion, not a therapy.
All right, Prim.
All right, so the next section I kind of have is a little game just called Let's See If We Can Point Out the Contradictions. So the first one starts with, radical feminist counselors vigorously communicated the goals and tenets of feminism, which included A, encouraging financial independence, B, viewing women's problems as being influenced by external factors, and C, suggesting that the client become involved in social action. Radical feminist counseling encouraged active participation in social action groups and other social justice causes to ensure societal change that embraced gender equity. And yet, a few pages later, all feminist counseling interventions seek to empower clients. The goal is to mobilize the client's resources to effect change at the personal, relational, and socio-political levels.
All therapists must have a Tumblr account.
It's like, your problems are totally caused by external factors, but let's empower you, that makes complete sense.
Let's empower you to do an endless crusade against an endless series of windmills.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Hey, well, it pays well.
Do you want to go to the next one? Level 2?
Level 2. The feminist perspective is grounded in the belief that traditional theories of human nature and human development, created by Western males in their own image, are not universally applicable. Rather, feminists believe it is essential to recognize that women and men are socialized differently, and that gender role expectations begin to influence human development from the moment a child is born. These expectations are strongly embedded in the fabric of society and have such a profound impact that they become deeply ingrained in the adult personality. Also, the masculine defines the feminine. That is, men determine the roles that women play. Because women are socialized to feel rather than act, and because society values action more than feeling, women are placed in a subordinate role. And 3 minutes later, feminine characteristics such as sensitivity, compassion, or subjectivity, which may be devalued as weaknesses when viewed through an androcentric lens, are revalued as strengths through the feminist lens. Thus, through reframing and relabeling, symptoms can be seen as coping mechanisms and weaknesses can be seen as strengths.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Behold the contradictions.
So, but this
I
logic...
think what they're...
But this logic, alcoholism could be seen as a coping mechanism.
Yes.
the inability to avoid drinking several nightcaps before bed is a strength, not a weakness. What?
I just love the idea of how women are socialized to feel more and to be more subordinate because of men. And yet, feminine characteristics need to be valued because they are somehow feminine and not, instilled falsely by the patriarchy.
Oh yeah. I didn't actually even see that contradiction there, Prim. So simultaneous with feminine characteristics being instilled in women by men because they're subordinate, we should value feminine characteristics, even though apparently there's something inflicted on men or on women by men.
Exactly.
Okay, how does one person contain this much flop in their brain? I'm not going to swear. In their brain at once.
Please do.
I value your restraint.
I'm restraining myself for this show. I wouldn't restrain myself on the ragening, but here I restrain myself. This is flop. This is a lot of flop. It's a lot of flop for one brain to contain without flopping.
Yeah, one aspect of this nonsense is that they depend completely on the ideas of socialization as being the be-all and end-all of human differences. And they are, their kryptonite is biological differences. I mean, that literally scares the death out of them. Yeah. So, and you can see that in the piece that was just read, the whole idea of socialization being the epitome of differences. And you talk about testosterone, and it's like a stake in the heart of the vampire. And there's all kinds of stuff out there biologically, how we're different. Men and women we're so different in so many different ways. And they really, if you say that to them, they get completely flipped out. When I was on the Division 51 mailing list of all these psychologists, from all over the country, and I said, why not start putting into your experiments the element of testosterone? You should have seen the responses. They were completely aghast that I would even say anything like that. It's fascinating, and the same thing with feminists. If you talk about testosterone and what it does to men, it flips them out because they go into this whole assumption that we're the same and the only thing that's different is our socialization. It's crazy.
I think if I may add to that, I think one of the things that really upsets them about the idea that testosterone creates, I think it's that it would create a different subjectivity. And that's not that men and women are the same, it's that men should be women. And there's no point of view other than the female point of view. Therefore, when you say, well, testosterone acts on the human brain in this way, creates a different kind of point of view, a different kind of attitude towards emotions, then you're starting to create a subjectivity that they can't have control over.
Yes.
And it's almost the same situation where gay and lesbian and trans individuals said, this is something that we're not choosing. It's a part of our biology. So when men can say this is not something we're choosing, this is a point of view that should be respected because it is a part of biology. Yes. I think they flip their shit because they just can't blame. Oh shit! I did it again. Oh,
yeah. You got to put another in the jar.
They flip out because the idea that testosterone has a particular effect on the brain, it creates a unique male experience, a unique male subjectivity, but it also gives men a biological reason for their behaviors, and not necessarily negative behaviors.
Stop them. It never stops them for a minute, though, from talking about the problems with testosterone poisoning. They will depart from all their socialization theories in a heartbeat to talk about the evils of testosterone and then go right back to saying the only differences are socialized. They're absolutely capable of doing that.
And the good thing is the research shows that there's no such thing as testosterone poisoning. It's very clear. And you just have to, here's the study, and it's like kryptonite. It drives them nuts. They can't stand it. And the best, the best thing is the trans men. And what the trans men have been writing for years now is that when they take large doses of testosterone, their whole approach to life shifts. They stop wanting to go talk with their girlfriend about their feelings, and they want to hit something now. It's like, and they talk about, oh my gosh, they talk about when they have these huge doses of testosterone, they have this sense of not being able to articulate their emotions when they're in the midst of feeling them. I can tell you just about every man I've ever talked to goes, he hears that, he says, yep, that's me. It's like, that's a testosterone thing that most of us men experience, that now we know from trans men, and they're writing, the women get the same thing when they take these huge doses. So
and that testosterone, by the way, comes in pretty handy if you want to do things like, I don't know, fly to Mars or cure disease.
Yes.
It works out pretty good.
Yes, in all kinds of ways.
I have two things to add to that. I just wanted to conclude one of my thoughts that I had earlier. I think that they don't like the idea of testosterone being a reason why men behave the way they do, and why they shouldn't be blamed necessarily for being in positions of greater risk-taking, which includes positions of greater power, right? Because it's just a function of our different biology. So that takes them away an option for them to blame men for the quote unquote patriarchy. Because if you say, well, it's a function of testosterone, men are just more attracted to more risk-taking occupations, and those risk-taking occupations just so happen to often be in charge out front, then you take away and you take away the ability for feminists to blame men for patriarchy. And so they say it's socialized there. Yep. But when they want to blame men for testosterone poisoning, what do? They go back to the idea of biology. And, and the only constant seems to be the word B, the word that starts with B, blame. That seems to be the only constant. And blame, and also casting men as the prime movers, and in no way, but at the same time saying, oh, hey, we're not creating a strict gender roles, even though in every single circumstance we cast men as the prime movers, especially when it can be blamed for something. So I wanted to point that out.
Yes, and this is one of the things that we can all do. The more we pull the whole idea of testosterone, what it's doing to men and to some women, out into the public sphere, the more it's going to dismantle feminism. We need to bring these physical differences. What I try and do on my YouTube channel and what I try and do on the Patreon channel is to bring out the idea that these emotions that men have versus what women have is literally based on testosterone and our differences. And we need to see that and love men for who they are. Men are good.
I just want to add one more thing that this might throw a monkey wrench into all of this. I've been chasing down the relative amounts of testosterone for the great apes, and the evidence that I've seen so far is that human beings have the most testosterone, at least from urine analysis. I don't know if that necessarily relates to blood serum or serum testosterone, but in terms of urine analysis, both male and female humans have more testosterone than other great apes. I just wanted to put that out there. So maybe that can be chalked up to why we are more cooperative and create social systems. Just saying.
And I think you can hear that some of what was read. I'd encourage people, if they get a chance, to go back and listen to everything that Prim read, these excerpts from the Feminists, and listen for the subtext of how they're not responsible for anything. You will see that woven in and out of every word and every paragraph, everything they had to say. The subtext is there. It's not my fault. And we've got to control other people and change other people to make up for my shortcomings. That's exactly what they're saying. And you will find that throughout most of your career in the mental health field.
It's funny that you should say that, because it gets worse. Some of the next sections that I've got here are some of the most egregious of the entire chapter. So the next one says, according to the DSM-4 TR, women are twice as likely as men to suffer from depression. From a feminist perspective, women have twice as many reasons as men to experience depression. Women, taught to be helpless and dependent and to please others, may feel that they are not in control of their lives or their environments. Their subordinate position, along with their experiences of domestic violence, sexual or physical abuse, poverty or harassment, or sex discrimination in the workplace, can result in a sense of powerlessness that can manifest as symptoms of depression. Oh, I need to get my fainting couch.
I think you just reinforced the point I just made. You could hear it dripping with it's not me, it's somebody else. And you know, something that's interesting is that my history of taking in clients with chemical dependency issues, guess what their line is when they start treatment? It's not me, it's somebody else.
Are you saying that feminism might be a chemical addiction?
I'm saying it presents the same level of denial and pathology that addictions present. Same avoidance.
I would say that it's entirely possible that that's the case, because we can become addicted to how particular narratives act on our brains.
Sure. Absolutely.
Our narratives can hit those buttons in our brains, just like drugs.
You can have a robust debate about what actually constitutes addiction, and there's not very many people that agree on that, but the pattern is quite similar.
Robust. Yeah. Sorry, this is the robust feminist arguments. I wonder if these would be considered those robust feminist arguments, because God knows if they're peer reviewed and they have a list of citations, they become robust.
Yeah, they're peer reviewed by their peers.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly right.
Oh my gosh. Speaking of pathology, it's funny that you should bring that up, because that is completely a male construct, as you shall see in a few seconds here.
Oh boy.
Finally, the feminist approach calls for a reformulated understanding of psychological distress. Feminist counselors reject the medical or disease model of psychopathology. The notion of psychological distress is reframed so that it is viewed as a communication about the experience of living in an unjust society. From this new perspective, psychic pain is not seen as a symptom of disease or deficit. Instead, it is defined as evidence of resistance and the will and skill to survive. Resistance is a term that describes a person's ability to remain alive and strong in the face of oppression.
Don't call me crazy.
Stunning and brave. Oh, God. Stunning and brave.
Oh, God.
Well, that's what it is. That was a diatribe of quit calling me crazy. This woman was married.
Yeah, I'll say. One quick line here. One of the ways that society has tended to devalue women's voices has been to prize the patriarchal norm of objective truth over subjective experience. So literally, feels over reals.
Right.
Except not men's subjective experiences. We can see when we try to say, you know, testosterone leads to a different subjective experience than women's. No, that's not allowed. There can be only the female subjective experience. Everything else is just an evil.
Well, I wonder how these people interpret something like cognitive behavior therapy or something where the objective is to put reals before feels.
I just wonder, like, as a person who has lived with a lifelong anxiety disorder, I just can't, I can't imagine being put into this therapeutic modality and how much damage it would have done.
Oh,
to reinforce my flawed thinking about the world.
It's just your strengths, Allison.
Well, that could be. I mean, I agree with you. I think there's been a lot of damage done by that, and particularly in the area of addictions, anxiety, some other life issues that were feminist involvement, where everything they're about is totally counter to what anyone has ever thought as being ameliorative with these problems. The whole idea is to manage emotions. and to not overreact to them. That is any treatment people get for general anxiety disorder, for panic disorders, any sort of cognitive oriented treatment for those things are going to focus on help changing the attitude in the individual toward the anxiety by managing feelings. Am I wrong, Tom?
That sounds about right.
So what they're prescribing is to feed into the anxiety, ultimately to feed into addictions too.
Yeah. Well, and to feed into their ideology.
Yeah.
I mean, that's their hook. That's the hook.
And it's easier to get you there when you're more vulnerable.
Yes.
And
definitely.
weaker.
And the next thing is, in fact, about how they decide to use these people who are suffering in order to try and push their narrative. The most fundamental of these principles is that the personal is political. The basis for this belief is that the personal or individual problems that women bring to counseling originate in social and political oppression, subordination, and stereotyping. Thus, the goal of feminist counseling is not only individual change, but also social transformation. Clients' responses are not viewed as dysfunctional or as having an intrapsychic origin, but are seen as ways of coping with an oppressive environment in which they have a subordinate status. Because the environment is a major source of pathology in the lives of women and other oppressed minorities, the toxic aspects of the environment must be changed if individual change is to occur. Their goal is to assist women not only to make internal psychological changes, but also to join with others in working towards social change that will liberate all members of society from subordination, oppression, and gender role stereotyping.
Slut walk for depression. I like it.
So depression, which having experienced depression and talked to quite a few people with depression seems to manifest as the belief that none of your actions can do anything to really affect a positive outcome in your life. It's sort of a learned helplessness. And what are they teaching them? Women who are depressed. Yeah, you're correct. Your actions can affect no positive outcome in your life. Like, do they not care that they are leaving their patients in misery?
Well, I mean, I know that if I were experiencing depression or anxiety and I was suddenly told that all of society was out to get me, I don't see how that would make it better.
Well, you see, Prem, it's not about making it better. It's about defeating the patriarchy by making everybody in mental health feel worse.
You'll
and then blaming
be better when all men are dead.
Oh, but feminism helps men too, don't you know?
Oh, yeah. I was tremendously helped by feminism. I just don't remember it. You know what that strikes me about all of this that is really the dangerous part, because there's a part of this, a lot of it is abusive toward people. It misses their issues. It fails to recognize people as individuals. It draws them into an ideology, all the negatives you would expect. But again, if you go back and just revisit everything that Prem read, another one of the dangerous things about all this is how attractive it is to destructive personalities, particularly like borderline. And it gives them a language to justify everything they do. It gives them an excuse to avoid personal accountability. It is a perfect match. I remember somebody saying something to a borderline woman 20 or 30 years ago. He said, all therapy does for you is give you a language to justify what you do. And this was a lay guy. He blue collar worker, didn't know anything, but he knew an awful lot in my book because he absolutely nailed the problem. This whole ideology is set up to motivate and inspire vindictive, destructive people to go out and create harm on others. And that's exactly what it does.
It's a really good point, Paul.
It motivates those kinds of people. It excuses them, and then anybody who's more inwardly turning in their pain, it just destroys them.
Yeah, it gives some people who are highly pathological a sense inside that they have a reason to be that kind of pathological. And oh boy, what more can you ask?
I mean, you think about somebody who is like kind of timid and introverted, and they're experiencing anxiety by maybe going outside their house. They have agoraphobia, and they go to a feminist therapist for help for whatever reason. But then this feminist tells them, oh, you know, it's the patriarchy that's making you feel that way. It's the male gaze that makes you uncomfortable in public. So clearly you should just fight for social change. But we're talking about somebody who is introverted and timid, and they're probably not going to feel that urge to go and fight for social change because that's not their way. But now they're stuck being bogged down thinking about how all the world is against them, and now you can basically just add a fear of men on top of that. It's disgusting, really.
Or sometimes they'll plant the suggestion, maybe your father sexually abused you.
Oh God.
What do you mean, maybe?
Okay, I have.
Yeah. And we got that from books like Courage to Heal, which were total feminist whack jobs that told women in treatment, in the general population, well, if you think something might have happened, it probably did. And what this does is lead people to think, well, if I can't eventually remember it, then it means there's something wrong with me. There is a phenomena of people trying to please their therapist. They try to impress them. They try to meet therapeutic goals so they'll feel like they've done well. And feminist therapists are terrible about planting suggestions of abuse of a sexual, physical, whatever nature, psychological, to give their clients something to attack. It's a horribly destructive practice, and it goes on to this day.
I've actually read about that, like implanted memories and that sort of thing.
Yes, there was a big deal about that in the 90s, and a lot of things blew up over it, but it's still pretty common practice.
Okay, so I just wanted to give a shout out to Joey Jojo, who gives us $5 and says the idea of feminist therapy is horrifying. I was educated mostly by feminist and misandrists. It did not end well for me. Thank you for that, Joey Jojo. And this is why we have these shows to describe this stuff and to call it out for what it is.
I'm glad you survived.
Yeah. Do you want to finish up with the final tidbits? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The last section is actually just a few notes that I gathered on how feminism helps men too, just because I thought you guys might find that amusing. Feminist therapy can be an effective method for working with men as clients. Men, as well as women, are oppressed by a patriarchal system and can work for social change. Social mandates about masculinity, such as restrictive emotionality, overvaluing power and control, the sexualization of emotion, and obsession with achievement can be oppressive to men. Feminist therapists routinely work with men, especially with abusive men and in battering groups. Issues that men can deal with productively in feminist therapy include learning how to increase their capacity for intimacy, expressing their emotions and learning self-disclosure, balancing achievement and relationship needs, accepting their vulnerabilities, and creating collaborative relationships at work and with significant others that are not based on a power over model of relating.
Can I just
be more like women?
Yeah.
Accepting their vulnerabilities. Okay. Accepting their vulnerabilities to whom?
Oh,
yeah, men don't have
vulnerabilities. To other men, of course. I feel like one thing I'm just curious about is that you've got an individual that's using an ideology to co-opt a mental health profession and to further their agenda using vulnerable people, yet they're concerned about men's obsession with power and control. Did I get that right?
Yeah, buddy.
Increase their capacity for intimacy. I think men are perfectly capable of intimacy. They just are intimate in their own way.
I'm sorry. My experience with men is that they're more capable of intimacy than women. That's my experience.
I'm not denying that, especially considering the stats after a divorce and the stats of who initiates divorce and who initiates the ends of relationships. I'm trying to say is that perhaps your model for intimacy is female, and maybe it doesn't encompass the subjectivity of men and how they experience intimacy.
I think there's no maybe about it.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I'm being facetious when I say maybe. It's definitely.
Yes.
And I think it ties back to that whole their inability or desire to dismiss testosterone as an effect on behavior. And I think part of it is because then they would have to, if there was a biological basis for maleness, which is what they deny, then they would have to agree that there is a masculine subjectivity that they are not party to and they can't control and that they have to respect. It's why they went to that whole. Myself and Teal Deer went over a feminist research paper in which they attempted to argue that feminists didn't have to take an interest in men's subjectivity, in this case, men's rights activists talking about how men are vulnerable to certain things like losing their children, suicide, mental health issues, why they didn't have to actually recognize that kind of a subjectivity, even though they had to recognize everybody else's subjectivity. And their conclusion was because men's rights activists are creating a symbolic phallus by emphasizing masculine subjectivity. So that they're regaining by emphasizing that vulnerability they're talking about, that intimacy, and that being able to express their emotions around experiences of vulnerability. Men are actually not expressing vulnerability, but in fact are expressing power over others because they are creating the symbolic phallus.
Pretty nice. That sounds legit.
I was thinking, like, okay, so what is this tightrope that men can walk? Feminists want them to express their vulnerabilities, but if they express a masculine subjectivity, that is creating the symbolic phallus and is just another expression of men's desire for control. Like everywhere, like there's nothing that men can do that doesn't have shame attached to it.
Except guilt. Remember, you're not allowed anger because of, obviously, that's patriarchy. And you're not allowed fear because that's the new cult of the phallus. But carry on with the guilt, gentlemen. That's a perfectly acceptable human emotion.
Yes.
All right. Well, I want to thank Paul and Tom and Prim for joining up and talking about these issues, especially since they were so very painful. Very, very painful. And little trip down into the mind of feminist therapy.
I'm sure that I'll find a way to forgive you, but I have to tell you, I'm bringing this up in the next patriarchy board meeting.
So I want to thank Tom and Paul once again. And if you're listening and you have a story about anxiety, please do send your stories to topic@badgerpod.com, because the next show we're going to be covering anxiety and how to deal with anxiety. Let's talk about it. Let's discover its source. Perhaps you felt some anxiety while we were reading this stuff today. Anyway, if you have a story about anxiety, if you've dealt with anxiety, if you've struggled with anxiety, please do send your stories to topic@badgerpod.com. And we will be doing a show on that shortly. Thanks again. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Tom and Paul, for coming on. Thanks, Prim, for reading. Thanks, Mike, for streaming and putting your 2 cents in there, here and there. And good night.